rule of rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And it does this through developing conventions and charters, Convention on Cybercrime, to give you an example of a more recent one. But in addition to the development of these legal instruments, the Council also works through cooperation and capacity building, as in the field of education. But who is the Council? Like any other organisation, of course, it has its staff, its secretariat, its structures, but the Council is you. The Council is its member states. The staff are from the member states. It has its own parliamentary assembly. They are members of parliament from the different member states. The Court of Human Rights has judges from the member states. And all the capacity building activities are organised by experts from the member states in conjunction with the national authorities. And I think that's important to know, because really it belongs to you, to the member states. It is, if you can see it, it is confusing, particularly sometimes when the words are translated. The Council of Europe is not the European Council. The European Council is the decision-making body of the European Union. In May this year, the Council held a summit of heads of state and government, the first such summit in 18 years. And you can probably guess what was the impetus for this summit. Of course, it was the war in Ukraine. And it produced a declaration really about democratic backsliding and a push for democratic renewal. I'm not going to read the text, but you can see already the link to education, and I think you can see already the link to language education in that word pluralism. For the Council of Europe, education is absolutely fundamental. It has a very broad view of the purpose of education, summed up in this question and answer. It's not about just preparing people for the job market, it's about the kind of societies we want, and people being able to participate democratically in those societies. It has a very broad education programme covering all of these areas, and you'll see there language, policy and practice. Well, as Gisela pointed out, there are two aspects to language education. There is the work done by the ECML, the European Centre for Modern Languages, which is an enlarged partial agreement. That means those countries who wish extra support with implementation take part in the centre, and it currently has 36 member states. And then there is language policy, which is primarily conducted in Strasbourg. So, as I said at the beginning, language policy has been part of the language education, part of the Council's work for almost 70 years. I'm younger than that, so I don't know about it all. In any case, over those 70 years, there have been many, many changes, many, many evolutions. And I'm just going to flick through. There isn't time to go into these. I hope the bottom one isn't hidden. The bottom one is the most recent, the adoption of a new recommendation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But you can see how it evolved. Very important to point out that the original work that led to the CEFR was actually for adults. It's about lifelong learning, gradually moved into the school sector, and as societies evolved and migration became a bigger and bigger question for Europe, moved into the area of the language of schooling and support for adult migrants. But I think what's really important to say is that from the very beginning, it was really quite revolutionary, because it was about the learner and the learner's needs. And that might seem very obvious to us now, but it was never really the case. If you think about how schools are organised, they're organised around timetables, teacher availability. It's very difficult, in fact, to begin genuinely with the learner's needs. And it was always about communication. So, with all of these evolutions, all of these things that changed and evolved, there's always been some fundamentals, and they have never, ever changed. Social justice and inclusion. It's always been at the heart of the Council's work. Promotion and preservation of cultural linguistic diversity, democratic citizenship, lifelong learning. Over here you can see a publication that was released to celebrate 60 years of the European Cultural Convention, and it's a very interesting summary of the work of language education at the Council of Europe. I would recommend it to you. You can click on it and it will download for you. Also, this publication, produced to mark the 25th anniversary of the ECML, there's a very interesting chapter in there from David Little looking at the history of language education at the Council of Europe. And he talks about these 3 defining principles. And you're all sitting there with your CEFR hats on. I think you can relate very clearly to these 3 defining principles. But they were there from the very beginning. And this last one, language education should be plurilingual and intercultural. Well, plurilingualism was first defined in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, but plurilingual and intercultural education really only got its full definition in the most recent recommendation. And I'd like to show you that for a moment. So what is it? What exactly is it, plurilingual and intercultural education? I'm not going to read it out. I'm hoping you can see everything, but just give you a moment to read that definition, the what. So it's really a very holistic concept, and some of you may be familiar with this visual, which attempts to capture all of the languages involved in plurilingual education. And of course, here you have the definition of plurilingualism from the CEFR. That's the what, but now comes the question of the why. Why bother? Well, if you take a look, I'm just reminding you of the what, so you can keep the what in mind. And if you look at the principles as defined in this most recent recommendation, I think that gives you the why. Why do we engage in plurilingual and intercultural education? Because it makes a difference to people's lives, because it makes for better, more cohesive societies. And what that means for all of us here as language professionals, it means that the work we do carries with it a huge responsibility, but I would say also a huge privilege. So, I'm coming to the end of part 1, and you'll be delighted to know that there are some parts that are very short. But I wanted just to show you another way of visualizing plurilingual and intercultural education. First of all, as I mentioned, it's this very holistic concept covering all aspects of language education. And in the middle of this circle, I'm going to put this diagram. I don't know how many of you have come across it. Produced by Miriam Egli and Marisa Cavalli in another attempt to visualize plurilingual and intercultural education and to show you that it's all articulated around values, around those constants that I talked about before, those underpinning principles. You can see the different parts. I'm not going to read them out to you. But what you don't see in this diagram is how Marisa and Miriam define the role of the antennae, and I think that's the most interesting part of it all. So, what are the antennae? The sensitivity of pedagogical choices to educational contexts and the needs of learners. And those pedagogical choices include, of course, choices around assessment. So it's really about being learner sensitive. So I don't think we can get to the technical alignment without first addressing these bigger questions, the questions of the values. I don't know if you all sign up to those values, and whether you all agree on the bigger purpose of language education. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, maybe you're not so sure. What matters is that we're given the time and the space to discuss our beliefs, to think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and to question our philosophies of education. So, I'm moving on to part 2. Why comprehensive? Why systemic? Well, when it comes to the CEFR, systemic alignment, as per the title of this event, is essential. But we also need to think about comprehensive approaches. And here I'm making an indirect reference to Barry O'Sullivan's work on comprehensive learning systems. He sees the CEFR companion volume as offering us all an opportunity to talk about our philosophies of education. And I think that's not just true for us as language professionals, but actually for the decision makers and for wider society. And it's okay to have different views. It's okay to disagree. That's all part of engaging with quality language education. So I'm going to turn now for a moment to the decision makers and what the Council of Europe is doing to get them on board with quality language education. And I'm going to go back to the recommendation that I mentioned. The Committee of Ministers is the Council of Europe's decision-making body. This is who they are and what they do. And in February of last year, they adopted this recommendation on the importance of plurilingual and intercultural education for democratic culture. Now, you might think, okay, up at that level, yeah, they all say yes, they sign a piece of paper, that's the end. Well, actually, that's not quite the case, because before it got to the Committee of Ministers, it went through a very long and detailed negotiation process with the Member States through the Committee of Education in Strasbourg, with the Governing Board of the ECML. There was an ad hoc working group and a drafting group, of which I was part. So that at the end, the text was really something that countries could sign up to. And although it's a recommendation and not a charter and not a convention, it's still a political commitment because they commit to implementing the recommendation. So why did the Council decide that language education needed to be put in the political spotlight? Because that's in fact what a recommendation is about. It's about drawing attention to an issue that is an issue across Europe. And you might think, why? Because we've already got one. We've got one on the CEFR. We've got one on the language of schooling. What on earth do we need another one for? Well, let's look at the name for a moment and the things that it's trying to address. These were the two developments of concern to the Council of Europe. English, and here I am speaking to you in English. English to the detriment of other languages, not excluding English, not saying people shouldn't be learning English, that's simply absurd, but that English should not be preventing people from learning other languages. And English teachers are the ones who should be opening the gates to the other languages because they are in a privileged position. But also this idea that the languages of migration are somehow harmful to our society. I think we know that that's the feeling in many European countries at the moment, and it's something, of course, of concern. So what is the recommendation asking us to do? If you break down the title, it's asking us to do two things. It's asking us to re-engage with the concept of plurilingual and intercultural education, to discuss it, to argue about it, to think it through. And it's asking us to think about how this actually makes a difference, or could make a difference, to our democracies. So, as you know, probably know many of you in the room, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail, but in order to help develop those democratic competences, the Council has this reference framework of competences for democratic culture. Interesting that within the definition of competence comes values, attitudes, okay? It's not just the technical skills or the knowledge that's there. And with every single of these one of these four areas, you can see a very clear link to language education. So, in a room full of researchers, teachers, language professionals, what on earth are we supposed to do with this big political instrument? Is it for us? I'd say yes. And I'm just going to show you very quickly ideas I have for you engaging with it. First of all, do you know about it? And if you don't, and could you tell other people now that you know about it? Publicise it, have it translated. And I'd like to express my thanks to Lent, who've done the translation into Italian. And of course, it's two parts. It's a recommendation and a detailed explanatory memorandum, and Lent has kindly translated both. So that's the first thing. Find out about it, publicise it, translate it into other languages. But the next thing to do is just open it. Open it at any page. It doesn't actually matter. Pick a short passage and use it to start a conversation. And I've picked one here, which I hope you can see. Can you? Not? Okay, I'm going to read it out then. Assessment plays an essential role in education at all levels, whether its purpose is to monitor progress, diagnose difficulties, offer opportunities to reflect on future learning, or measure achievement. If curricula and pedagogy aim to promote plurilingual and intercultural learning for democratic culture, it is essential that all modes of assessment respond to this objective. That's got implications for all of you. The central role played by self-assessment in the European language portfolio implies the possibility of an assessment culture in which learners also have a voice. Do the learners have a voice in the kind of assessments that you develop and that you undertake? So there really is something in there for all of us. And I've just taken one. You can do control find CEFR, control find assessment, and there's lots of passages to engage with. There are some webinars to give you some more ideas. And then once you've done that, what else can you do with it? Well, you can use it to review the policy in your institution. You can use it to develop a new action plan. And if you're a researcher, you can use it to review the research that you're doing through that plurilingual and intercultural lens. Okay, so where to from here? So I'm just going to show you now very, very quickly the work that's currently being done in Strasbourg under language policy. Work on the CEFR and the companion volume. If you haven't looked at the website recently, take a look. It's got some really fantastic videos to use and some nice ideas for implementation. There's all the magnificent work being done to support the linguistic integration of migrants and refugees. I don't have time to go into that today, but I'd like to say a big thank you to all of you involved, and particularly to Lorenzo. That initial toolkit that was developed is now being expanded. It's currently being piloted, and we hope to launch an even bigger toolkit early next year for all migrants and refugees, including younger learners and including unaccompanied minors. That's what's going on there. And there's a very interesting project going on Romani, supporting Romani as part of the agenda for inclusion. So, thank you. Okay, we've mentioned the CEFR, we've mentioned the RFCDC, the Reference Framework for Competences for Democratic Culture. But in that notion of a comprehensive approach, it's important not to forget all of the other tools that have been developed. And there's no time, they're all hyperlinked, but I'm going to flick through a few. These ones we know. What about FREPA, the Framework of Reference for Pluralistic Approaches? FREPA, in fact, is the bridge between the CEFR and the CEFR companion volume, because it was the first instrument to really take that notion of plurilingual competence and try to define and come up with descriptors for learners. And there's lots more than just the framework. There's a lot of follow-up material. Then there are three important guides: guides for developing policy, guides for plurilingual and intercultural education, guides for the language of schooling in all subjects. And here, if you can see them, there's the curricular framework for Romani, based on the CEFR, and here are three more, just a sample. The first one here is looking at digital learning, but through that socio-actional approach, very much based on the CEFR, with fantastic activities for upper secondary and university. The middle one is a guide we produced at the ECML to try and find out what did we learn during COVID, all the things that went wrong, all the things that actually went right, and how can we make sure that we move forward based on for teachers involved in language education. So many, many tools that you can look at in your. There is also a thematic area in the field of our quality matrix, and the main authors were Brian North and Enrica Picardo, and it's very much about curriculum renewal using the CEFR with some fantastic examples of practice. There's a new project looking at mediation from the companion volume, in this case interlinguistic mediation, and then there is a project from the ECML about to be completed on home languages, assessing the home languages of migrant children. There is the ECML Relang initiative, supporting countries to relate their tests, assessments and curricula to the CEFR. And probably, which you maybe can't, aha! Yes. You have a link to the ECML colloquium from last December, and if you'd like to see some very interesting examples of impact, what happens when a country over a number of years brings in experts to look at their curricula and their examinations, there are some really lovely case studies of impact there. So, very, very quickly, the ECML current programme is about to conclude with a big conference in December, and these are the projects coming to an end and the different formats that they will take. No time to go into the detail, but I think what you can see here is there are some resources there of particular interest to you, perhaps the project on the CEFR Companion Volume Toolbox. And I'm showing you all of this because this is about a comprehensive approach, and it's comprehensive also in terms of engagement with member states, with experts, and with many others. So at the highest level, the Committee of Ministers, the decision makers, here is the structure of the ECML reaching out into the member states, and I cannot forget the wonderful support we received from the Austrian authorities. And this is the ECML's Professional Network Forum. I'm delighted that my colleague Valdek is in the room. Valdek set this up. And this really brings together INGOs working in the field of language education, 16 of them who share their expertise with us, and that's a really wonderful gift to EFR. I think that's really lovely that we're working together. So ALTE plays a very important part, not just as a founding member of the Professional Network Forum, but in fact, years and years of working with the Council of Europe. And I'm going to apologise in advance to Nick in case I've forgotten anything, because I may well have. But just look at this. Look at what ALTE has done for the Council of Europe. And I think that's really wonderful. And this is my opportunity to say thank you to ALTE for that. But it's what I go back to about the Council of Europe belongs to you, to the member states, to the INGOs, to the governments, etc. It's not some distant organisation removed from the people. Okay, parts 3 and 4 are very, very short. You'll be relieved to know. So, the way ahead. I'm just going to very quickly show you, because I have two hats, this is what it's going to look like, and these are my kind of guiding principles as I take the work forward. It's very challenging, but it's also, I would say, very, very exciting. And what's providing the framework for both the programme in Strasbourg and the programme in Graz is this new recommendation. So we really are working much more closely together. And when it comes to language policy, these are the priorities that have been decided for the next 4 years. I'll just give you a moment to look at them. Why? Why have we decided to focus on policymakers and on key messages? Well, if there's anyone in the room who suddenly becomes responsible for language education within a ministry, we all know there are internal shufflings, and suddenly it's on your desk, where would you start with that website? There's so much. So what we want to do is say less is more. There's loads of wonderful resources, maybe new ones are also needed, but let's begin with what we've got and let's pull out those key messages and align them to the recommendation so that member states can think about how to put the recommendation into practice. For example, the role of home languages, languages in higher education, languages in early years. So key themes from the recommendation and key messages, with that principle that less is in fact more. And we will be reintroducing the language education policy profiles, but in a much smaller version, where countries can say, can you help me with just this topic or just that topic? And it will be much more low-key, but it will be a process of support for the member states. When it comes to the ECML, well, we've just finished evaluating our project proposals. We received 32 project proposals, 19 4 years ago, so that's really, really quite impressive. I can't give you the results because we're still in negotiation with the experts, unfortunately, but this is what's guiding us. And I like the heart. They're right. In fact, it doesn't really matter how many instruments, because they're instruments. Okay? We need, and we've seen the rich resources that there are, but we won't bring about that positive change unless the attitudes and the values are there too. And I'd like to wind the clock back for a moment and remind you of what happened with the CEFR and of the outcomes of the 2007 forum held in Strasbourg and entitled The CEFR and the Development of Language Policies, Challenges and Responsibilities. A forum organised because at that point the Council was a little bit worried about the emphasis on examinations from the CEFR. In that report, Danielle Coste, who was one of the authors of the original CEFR, wrote, and I am slightly paraphrasing because the sentences were quite long, the framework has meaning in the context of plurilingualism, social cohesion and participatory democracy, only in terms of a far broader set of analyses and strategies, mobilising the responsibilities of numerous players and authorities in addition to those active in the education system. The framework is an instrument of reference, not an object of reverence. I think those words are as true today as they were back then. And so while it is a standard-setting instrument, fundamental to its philosophy is the importance of context. It's not meant to be a straitjacket. Remember those constants, learner-centred. Language education begins with the learner and his or her, their needs. No one size fits all. We need to find the way to manage the tensions between standards on the one hand and contextualised responses on the other, and use that tension as a space for growth and development. Comprehensive learning systems are complex, dynamic, and ever-evolving, and innovation is not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but about critically reviewing what's already there and building on it. And so, I repeat my circle, but here this virtuous cycle, which we can see that the CEFR and the companion volume can support. But complex dynamic systems require complex dynamic responses. Because ultimately, to get this right, it needs to be multifaceted, diverse, comprehensive, and coherent. Systemic alignment is not just about learning, teaching, and assessment. It's about aligning Council of Europe values with national values. It's about aligning European with national policies. It's about top-down and bottom-up developments and a range of complementary activities in different formats, because only together can we actually achieve the success of plurilingual and intercultural education. More than one academic has used the term paradigm shift in relation to the CEFR companion volume, and they're right. But in the end, it's your commitment, your endeavours that will bring about real, sustainable change. And I'm going to finish with two quotes, whose messages I hope I would encourage you to keep in mind throughout the rest of the day and in all your future endeavours. All our work should be directed towards criticality. We should talk about critical language awareness, critical intercultural awareness, critical communication. I understand empowerment as something very strong in the sense that it allows educators, teachers, and students to be critical and to recognise social injustice. It allows them to actively and positively critique policies worth holding in our heads. And the final one, which I need to read from here because it's so dark there I can't read it, we mustn't forget this. We need a firmer commitment to understanding those practices of language teaching, teacher learning, and language teacher education that illuminate how teachers can be helped to make a difference to their students' lives in the language classroom. It's not about us. It's about our learners. And with that, I thank you for your attention.